Welcome to SikhCast, brought to you by Sikh Research Institute, illuminating every path.
In today's episode, Harinder Singh and Jasleen Kaur will navigate the intricate backdrop of recent events in Canada. They will uncover key insights and context needed to make sense of the current developments, explore their global implications for Sikhs, and learn how to approach them thoughtfully and strategically. And of course, they will delve into why the guidance from the Guru Granth Sahib holds such significance in addressing this critical situation. Stay tuned for a captivating discussion ahead.
Waheguru Ji Ka Khalsa, Waheguru Ji Ki Fateh. My name is Jasleen Kaur, and I'm a research associate on the State of the Panth reports at SikhRI, as well as a transcreator on the Guru Granth Sahib project. I'm joined today by Harinder Singh, who is the Senior Fellow and Innovation Director at the Sikh Research Institute. Harinder Singh leads the Guru Granth Sahib project, and he also focuses on developing critical thinking for individuals and institutions via the State of the Panth reports. He's a widely respected educator and thinker attempting to live one force, oneness paradigm that radiates in all. Guru Fateh Harinder Singh, thanks for joining me.
Warji Khalsa, Warji Fateh.
So we are here today to discuss the larger context around the latest events in Canada and to understand Canada and India disharmony in the Sikh-Panjab context. So for those who are kind of in need of more background information, in June of this year, Hardeep Singh Nijjar was assassinated outside of the Gurdwara in Surrey, Canada, where he served as president. This was less than a week after Avtar Singh Kunda in the UK also died mysteriously. This past month, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau said that agents of the Indian government carried out the killing of Nijjar, a Sikh community leader in BC last June. And speaking in the House of Commons, Trudeau said he raised India's involvement in the shooting of Hardeep Singh Nijjar directly with Prime Minister Narendra Modi at the Group of 20 summit meeting earlier this month in no uncertain terms. And he said that allegation was based on intelligence gathered by the Canadian government. India has since denied this allegation. So all that sort of being said, if we can jump into first looking at Harinder Singh, what sort of lens can we look at all of this through? Do we look at this in the context of the events of February and March, in light of the farmers' movement? Why should we be paying attention to this as Sikhs and Punjabis? Like, why does this matter? I think those are the major questions I wanted to just start with before we get into more details.
Sure. I mean, the simple answer is this is on every Sikh's mind. Doesn't matter their political persuasion, doesn't matter their level of adherence. They're all asking about this. This is a conversation definitely in every Sikh household. This is a conversation in most Punjabi households, if not all of them. And now it has entered multiple Indian households to global phase, which is being covered in the multiple ways. So that's why. And for Sikhs and Punjabis, this matters because this is something we keep dealing with. Now this has got on the center stage in a global perspective involving Western democracies. Earlier, we would be dealing with South Asian stuff primarily, which are also called autocracies, including India now, according to the ratings given earlier this year by the Norwegian agency. So the point being, the reason it matters is because we have been at the receiving end of these, and now it's in focus. And unless we understand ourselves what's going on and what is the sort of Gurbani's guidance on this, we will not know what to do. Then we will wait for another event, and only activists will be talking about it. Since it has entered each Sikh household and each Punjabi household, we must understand it from Gurbani's perspective. We must understand this from Sikh and Punjab's historical perspective of last 6 months and last 10 years, and since 1980s, since 1947, even to some extent. That's the context of it. And just to keep it only short term, for example, I remember you and I was discussing this when we did our earlier podcast, and I recall the hukum which was come that day, and we said, it said that the one likes everyone, one is driving everyone, everyone is in one's command, and one is the phrase we use for a Koankar. Gurbani uses that. But the great irony and the wonder is that the one sees all of them, but they aren't able to see the one. And they being, the worldly people, the people who are controlling the money, and people who are in the positions of making the pronouncements and judgments. Actually, it is that in that Shabad. And when I was looking at the Shabads this week and the apps in what has happened in last 2 weeks, for example, the Shabad which came was that Guru Nanak Sahib is questioning how can an ignorant leader guide? And this ignorant leader is not just about the state of India. This is the state of Punjab. This is the state of Sikh affairs. This is really something we need to look at from a local leadership all the way to global leaderships. And then answering that, Guru Nanak Sahib says, look, unless one pleads identification with the Naam, which is essentially having the wisdom and feeling the oneness in this world, we will all act like foreigners. And the reason I bring this up is because this conversation between Canada and India becomes very important. And where do Sikhs locate themselves? Where do Punjabis locate themselves? And Guru Nanak Sahib says, look, if the mind becomes a foreigner, then all nations seem foreign. So before whom do I open my bundle for its overflowing with pains? And the actual lines which I want to recite here, because I think Sikhs and Punjabis relate to it, which is Man pardesi je thiye sab des paraya, kis pa kholu gantadi dukhi paraya. So this idea of we feel foreign in our own native lands, and we feel foreign in foreign lands if certain things are not being answered. This is why it really matters, because it has entered each Punjabi and Sikh.
Yeah, I think that's a helpful framing as we get more into this conversation, which maybe feels overwhelming for some of our listeners. So that's really helpful. Thanks. I think maybe we can start with what else we know now that we have a better framing. So we know that since, I guess, sort of the beginning of this past month, Canada has expelled Indian diplomat Pavan Kumar Rai, who was stationed head of Indian intelligence. India has also expelled a Canadian diplomat who was stationed head of Canadian intelligence. Both countries have paused their trade negotiations on their bilateral free trade agreement. Both have issued travel advisories to each other's countries. There's this back and forth that's happening. But then also outside of just those two countries, Australia, the UK, the US have all called these reports on Indigenous killing concerning. And they've stated that they've also raised this issue with their Indian counterparts. We know that the FBI visited Sikh activists in the US to warn them about death threats after the killing. We know that reports have come in on how Canada's investigation into the murder was actively supported by the US. We know that US Secretary of State Antony Blinken addressed that growing tension between Canada and India and called for accountability on the part of India. So that's a lot that's happened. I guess my question is sort of, now that we know all of that, how have different players, both within and outside of India, responded to these events? So I'm thinking of not just politicians, but also Sikh institutions and organizations, media, whether, we're talking about more independent journalists or journalists who are more aligned with sort of state media. And I was thinking specifically that maybe you could touch on Congress's statement, the Indian National Congress's statement, and that of Subramaniam Swamy on the Nijit killing, as well as this question, which I know we've talked about, of how journalists who maybe are more independent and take more issue or raise their voice against sort of domestic agenda issues have seemed to generally align with the state narrative on national security and this question of terrorism. So I know that's a large question, but maybe you could kind of take us through some of those examples so we get a better picture of how people are responding.
Yeah, let's break it down into a couple of segments, because sure. Otherwise we may not be able to cover and take our audience through this journey as well as to what really is happening, because we need to be able to digest it. And at the onset, I will say, we still don't know much. We know some stuff, And the reason we say the sum here I'm qualifying relative to earlier in global sense, we know a lot, because this is why there's a global coverage. And that's something we need to keep in mind, that this has never since, not even since 80s, I can say, that this much coverage on the Sikh issues has come up. So which means intelligence and the Western democracies, the state of India, what is happening in Punjab, what is happening with Sikhs, what is happening with other minorities, all that has brought this into focus. So this is a case study. That's why Globe is interested in this. Globe is interested in this because there is a whole international and geopolitics angle to it. So coming back to it, I think for our audience, it's important to know that last 2 weeks is what we know now, but intelligence agencies were expecting something already. And I say this because in the March of 2023, because we were connecting into earlier part of this year, FBI and Australian Federal Police, they put out advisories on threats and interferences in Punjabi, in Gurmukhi script, which means this was very much about Sikhs and Sikhs from the Indian side of Punjab. And they are essentially telling them, this is what you need to do if you are being threatened. This is what you need to watch out if there are going to be interferences. So that explicitly happened in Australia and in America. So there is something to be said about that. And second things, and by the way, they didn't say this is only for immigrants or citizens or residents. It's anyone who's in that country. So we have to understand something was already cooking. They have been observing as to what's been happening in the state of India and how it is going to get played out in Western democracies, especially in case of Australia and America in this case. That's one thing. Second thing, we have to understand what else is going on for this context. India is going through its own conversation. And that conversation is, that there's a whole debate actually. Within this G20, it came center stage, which was this whole thing about, is India Bharat or is India India? So there is a whole, and I like to bring the Sikhi angle and Guru Nanak Sahib into this conversation, because Guru Nanak Sahib used the phrase Hindustan when he used the term Khorasan Khasmana Kiya Hindustan Daraya, which means one sovereign saved Khorasan, but the terror came to Hindustan. So this idea of the one, one observing, and through us, we observe many things, and I'll get into this a little bit later, if need be, but India is going through this debate. So there is this thing about India claiming its own place, or is it becoming more right-wing Hindutva state, and where Hinduism is what will matter. So that debate is happening, which is terrorizing Indians itself. Within that debate, there are lots of oppositions which are talking about these things. So your question about, well, when opposition is terrorized itself within India, but when it comes to international affairs, they don't speak against the government. And that's something we need to understand. And the media does something very similar too. There is opposition in India to the current administration. There is very few independent medias left within India. But when it becomes something on the international stage, they do not question the state, because this becomes an issue for their survivals in India. And we have to understand that. When it comes to Sikhs and Punjabis, look, SGPCs and Akalis, they are definitely playing a role in it. But there was a long silence from Sikh intelligentsia on it. People who otherwise need to speak. For example, it's coming out now. There are so many Sikhs serving in Indian administrations themselves. They never really even bring some context to it. In private, they say, we cannot, but in public, they are not able to. But Sikhs who are not with the administration, those who are not in Indian administrative services or police or intelligentsia or foreign service, even they stay silent. And this is something we need to really question. Even Punjab's politicians on this issue stayed silent, which means they don't know how to deal with when India starts presenting certain things internationally, because they don't want to be seen as anti-India, because that game is getting played. So I think it's very telling, and we should not expect that sitting in the diaspora. We need to understand the Indian context of it. But those who are doing their best to talk about it, and there are a few instances of that within Punjab, within India, outside of Punjab, which we call Inspora, and then outside in the diaspora, I think, and in fact, I even called for it. I think they need to start seeing themselves as allies in this conversation, and they need to keep presenting the facts. And a lot of that, I think, for the last 2 weeks is very praiseworthy, to be honest. There was primarily effort outside of Punjab, outside of India, where Sikhs and Punjabis have starting to play a role in providing a better positioning and the narrative as to what's going on.
Yeah. That's all. Yeah, that's all really helpful. I think then I wonder, like, we've sort of, I guess, touched on the conversation happening in different circles. I'm wondering how you largely understand kind of the significance of Trudeau's statement. I know that as a team at SikhRI, we sort of talked about it in one of our meetings. And so this question of like, is this electioneering has come up? Is this, I don't know if pandering is the right word, but there is this question of like, what could possibly be motivating a statement like this? And how do we sort of digest it in a way that is more realistic? So I guess that's my first question. And then I definitely have follow-ups, but I'll ask that one first.
Look, I mean, there are going to be elections in India and there are going to be elections in Canada. That is a given. And there is always an element of that, but this is not primarily being driven by that. And this is what the reason I'm saying that is because you have international agencies talking about this now. This issue is not escaping or limited to one country, in this case, Canada. So when we talk about Biden administration's positions on this openly, which you said in Secretary Blinken saying things, what UK government has been saying, even the Prime Minister on the sidelines when he met Prime Minister Modi, what the Five Eye intelligences are saying about these things. So no, this is not just about electioneering. We need to look at that the world has been observing India for the last several years. And in that observation, they know that the press freedom in India is at the bottom 1/10. I mean, it's below 150, I think, the last ratings I saw.
Yeah.
We know earlier this year that the Early Warning Project, which talks about statistical risk assessment of mass killings, they put India in the top 10 list. And it was the only quote unquote democracy in that list. So world is observing. Even within India, there is a very clear understanding that there are lots of extrajudicial killings going on. In fact, the number one of the Indian organization put out was 800. And I want to mention this, that there were 800 individuals which were killed in extrajudicial killings, but nobody was convicted since 2016, the 800 since 2016. So even on that list, Punjab was number 14, and it was less than 5 killings, but Sikhs are always talking about it. And that's the point we need to understand, that we are not interested in even in one extrajudicial killing. We are not interested in that if the gangsters were used to do that even with somebody named Sidhu Moosewala, which the Punjabi Sikh world knows very well, even the global hip hop world knows. So India is being watched from multiple angles, that this is a place where mass killing and the genocidal campaign can restart anytime. This is where extrajudicial killings have become a norm. And in the Punjabi Sikh context, I want to just remind, this is why Sikhs like to talk about Jaswant Singh Khaldra. His anniversary was going on when this was going on. He used to say that. He said, I appeal to the all democracy-loving people in the world that if I am killed, don't just hold two people, don't just hold people who are implementing the orders responsible. I only want you to hold two people responsible. That was the Chief Minister of Punjab at the time, Beyan Singh, and the Director General of Police, KPS Gill, at the time. So the point being that this is a state which is orchestrating this. You go beyond Punjab, that is the Indian state which is doing this. And the world has been watching these things. So Trudeau's statement speaks to that. The Five Eyes intelligence sharing speaks to that, which involves the countries where a lot of Sikh events, where the Sikhs have been targeted as well. So no, this is not just about electioneering. This really is about that focus is on India. Focus is on India, what it does wrong, calling itself democracy, And these issues are going on throughout India. But when these issues happen with Sikhs in Punjab, we are very vocal about it. We are very vocal about it because it has happened with musicians, it has happened with human rights activists, and it actually has also happened in the case of Niger sympathizers or supporters of Khalistani militants as well. But that doesn't mean that extrajudicial killing is going to become a norm. And I'm saying this because a lot of Indians and other people have drew this contrast that America did this with Osama bin Laden, for example, or Soleimani. And that contrast we need to understand. There is no comparison. I mean, this is just a false comparison. And the reason I say that is because those were considered imminent threat, and the killings were justified as defensive, right, under the international law. In this case, India has not admitted to it because it is violating the international law, which goes from UN Charter to what ICJ says about how to prosecute those people who do that. So it actually is about Indian policies within India and Indian operations outside India.
Yeah, and so you had mentioned this like targeting of Sikhs in a lot of those Five Eyes countries, so the US, Canada, UK, Australia, and we've talked a little bit about sort of the pattern that we've seen of a lot of sort of right-wing aligned think tanks putting out particular reports about this question of like separatism and equating separatism with terrorism, when we know that like constitutionally it's perfectly valid to seek sovereignty in the countries where this is happening, and also in the Indian constitution itself, that's not against the law. And so I think that's important to keep in mind. I'm going to save a little bit of that discussion for later on in our conversation, but that trend paired with what I'm seeing now as kind of a waking up in terms of like those same countries where Sikhs are being targeted, waking up to kind of the threats to their own sovereignty as India sort of oversteps and carries out these extrajudicial killings, I do think is quite a big deal. So I'm wondering how you kind of see this statement of Trudeau's and the things that we talked about at the beginning of the conversation sort of happening post that statement, continuing to affect the global conversation. I know that I'd already mentioned before that these trade agreements between Canada and India have kind of fallen by the wayside. And I know that like in the US and in Canada, especially this sort of prioritization of trade agreements with India sort of over and against China's sort of power in that sphere has been really important. And so I'm trying to understand maybe how we might see the effect of the past 3 months on like geopolitics more broadly and also international trade, because that's come up quite a few times. Yeah.
So, I mean, it's on everyone's mind. This is why the foreign governments are taking a particular interest in this. So we used to talk about why is the international community allowing some of these things? It's like precisely because of those reasons. They also have to deal with the issue of Russia, the issue of China. And India, they saw as a partner because relative to all these things, India was committing that it is solving these problems. But they were noticing that when Indians themselves who are in dissent and international organizations who independently measure these things are clearly showing, including the US administration, that this is not the case. So this is the dilemma which I think the international community deals with. This is probably one of the reasons why in last 2 weeks you have Economist, the Times of London, New York Times, Washington Post. I mean, you name the publication, they are all putting out serious op-eds, obviously multiple articles and investigations, but also editorials.
Yeah.
Because what we have to understand is there's an International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, which was drafted, I think, in 1976, which says that every human being has the inherent right to life, and that right shall be protected by the law, and no one shall be arbitrarily deprived of his life. So this principle, the Western democracies have been working with. It is considered a norm in international law. I think what has happened this time is, it is not a secret that in South Asia, India does this. They do extrajudicial targeted killings outside of Indian borders as well. But what has happened in this time is that they have done it in a Western democracy, even with their own hypocrisies. This element, Western democracies do hold at a higher standard. This ICCPR convention, which I'm saying. So when you are justifying killings as necessary to maintain law and order or combat terrorism, or even suppress dissent, people can read between the lines. I mean, this is not, Western democracies have done that as well. But in India, what has happened is that extrajudicial killings, authorities are taking a little bit different angle to it. And that's the worrisome part, which I think people in India have been noticing and recording rather for a long time. But now this is explicitly coming out in the world. And that's something we need to keep in mind. In the long run, even in the short run, we know economics trumps human rights. That's just how it is. But what we don't understand in this is that there are limits being crossed. There are norms being crossed. We know laws get violated all the time, but there are norms which are getting crossed. And even when it comes to trade, the norms of Punjab trade on the Indian side with the Punjab trade on the Pakistani side is not being allowed, while the Gujarat trade is being allowed with Pakistan. So Punjabis and Sikhs are very aware of these things. I think what is happening is that international sort of governments and organizations want to make that an issue and want to discuss this. And my hope, honestly, is that maybe India will actually start changing its internal policies. Maybe it will start following some of the norms. We are all hypocrites. We know that every government is a hypocrite, but there is a limit, and that limit has been crossed multiple times. And now the international norms were getting crossed.
Yeah. Okay. So you've sort of begun to mention something that goes into the next question. So we had talked in the last podcast, and we've talked before about Sikhs in the homeland and in the diaspora, but we also made this distinction between the Inspira and the diaspora. So those Sikhs living in India, but outside of Punjab. And I'm wondering, like, in this sort of series of events, do you feel that there is a difference, or that there ought to be a difference, or both, in how we understand and respond to the issue of extrajudicial murder in these various subcommunities? So homeland, Inspira, diaspora.
I mean, of course, there's a difference, and we need to accept that. Its difference exists because of the realities they live in. The realities of Punjab, of Indian side, East Punjab, are a little bit different than other states. Although I showed that Punjab's extrajudicial killing ratings for last 5 years have come down, but Punjab makes it an issue to talk about it. But the gangster murders are going up. And those gangsters are sitting in Indian jails and taking credits for extrajudicial targeted killings themselves. So something is not right with it. But coming to your question more directly, look, of course, when we are sitting outside, we like to invoke UN Charter all the time, which makes sense because the countries we live in, again, I didn't mention this convention, the UN Charter very clearly says that all member states shall refrain from the threat or use of force against the territorial integrity or political independence of any state. So when this happened in Canada, they're working with this. There are assassins hired by every country. That's why India is getting compared to Mossad, Israel's Mossad as well, but every country has that. But then they have this imminent danger thing. In this case, they are not able to establish that with Hardeep Singh Nijjar's case, right? So I think what Punjabis need to understand, and I think Punjabis really understand this well, I'm going to say this, when it comes to something happening with a Punjabi, they actually are able to say much more. Like, just this week, they made Shubh's song an issue because Inquisitive did a graphic of it, which showed India in a particular way. And they both explained why they did it. So the Punjabi politicians all talked about it. Even a couple of non-Punjabi Indians also start talking about it. why is India making this as an issue? Why are Indians making this an issue?
Mm.
So Punjabis are able to push the agenda to the Indian agenda, and that's huge in today's realities of India. They are doing it at the cost of a sitting MLA gets picked up by every government has charged him, regardless of which government has come in. So the realities of Punjab, they are able to push the Punjab Sikh issue to one extent. Rest of the Indians, and I include there not just the administration. For example, when this Shubh thing happened, there's a conversation happening at JNU and the left. And we need to understand that the left of India doesn't really support as much some of these Sikh and Punjab issues. We understand why they don't in certain political cases, but they don't even do it when it comes to some of these songwriters' cases. So there is opportunity there that instead of looking at Akalis did this, or Congress did this, or AAP is doing this, or Sada is doing this, these are the political parties in Punjab which are active, they need to be looking at what are Sikhs doing, what are Punjabis doing. And when they do shift that focus a bit, you do see some consolidation and support as it happened during farmers' protest. And I think the last thing on the diaspora would be they need to keep at it. They really do need to keep at it because, look, Canadians especially, Canada is not in conflict with India, and India is not in an armed conflict with the activists in Canada. So there is something else going on here. And that something else is about what in the last 40 years, Canadian Sikhs know this very well, that everything becomes about people who look like Sikhs are being presented as terrorists or militant Khalistanis. Well, terrorists and Khalistanis themselves have to be contextualized. They are not. US and America has very strict laws, and they have done extraditions in the past, but this is not that. Okay? This is where there is targeting and maliciousness, wherein America, in Canada, in US, in UK, and New Zealand, we'll mention is the fifth country, but not as many incidents there, where there have been Sikhs being presented in a bad light and blaming it on Khalistanis. So again, what they mean by Khalistani there is that Khalistanis are terrorists. So when the state is doing that, there is a problem.
Yeah.
Sikhs are very aware of it. Punjab is very aware of it. Now the foreign governments have become quite aware, and they have put out circulars, as we referenced earlier. So I think what we need to do is provide the right positioning, those Sikhs who are sitting in US and Canada, and honestly, those who are serving in administrations here. Our asks need to become very explicit. We don't just need statements. We welcome all the statements which have come out once their party leader decided to come out. We understand that this has happened in Canada, this has happened in the UK, this has happened when the things were very hard in Australia. This has happened today in California, but we need to be doing more. And that more is, what are the one or two specifics which have to be dealt with? And this is where our positioning and our clarity is so much more important. Our asks need to be something which is establishing that Sikhs are not part of the problem here. They are being presented as part of the problem. The problem exists with certain policies of the Indian state. Problem exists with certain grievances of Punjab and Sikhs with the Indian state. And that's where we need to get to.
Yeah. And I think that really nicely brings us to my last question, which is, about this state narrative that gets sort of disseminated always, which is so much sort of hinging on calling Sikhs who raise these human rights issues Khalistani terrorists, or calling Khalistanis or separatist terrorists, and kind of using that. Definitely not kind of using that as a way to disregard valid grievances, unaddressed grievances that have continuously been brought to light by these Sikh activists and community leaders. So I'm just wondering, how do we as Sikhs individually, as a Bandh, in our communities, make sure that we do not fall into that state trap of focusing only on this question of Khalistan? And sort of what reframings can we offer when we're having these discussions, because we've talked so much about like the importance of our own narrative and like sort of reclaiming that in the midst of these larger state narratives. Yeah, I guess I'm wondering how we can kind of not fall into that trap.
Yeah, well, let's start where the popular culture is, right? Because we do need popular culture's help. And I think there is a sort of, I don't want to call it a dilemma, but something like that is going on, even in the popular culture of Sikhs and those who know about Sikhs, including in India and America and globally speaking. So, when Sikhs are being presented in the best forms, we talk about the warriors. But in the past, there's something interesting going on there. Like Hari Singh Nalwa gets talked about, Maharaja Ranjit Singh gets talked about, generals who have done great things for India gets talked about, against Pakistan on top of it. When the medals are being given in Canada and UK, it's talked about how they have been in the best of the services. We are always saying, look, we have a defense minister in Canada formerly, and we have a police chief in Malaysia and a defense minister in Singapore. I mean, there is this warrior element is brought out a lot. I know there's a problem with it because that's a stereotyping, but even popular culture does this. Even lately when Dallas Cowboys team said Carpe Omnia, seize everything or seize all, they showed a Sikh warrior in there where their own coach McCarthy talked about they chose this two-sword Sikh warrior image because of its inspiration.
Yeah.
So let's understand that inspiration. I think I'm most interested in that first. And this is where Gurbani and Punjab and Sikh history comes together. Our inspiration has always been coming from Ikku Our warriors also come from Ikku And the world loves that warriors when they fight an unjust state. So when Sikhs do that in contemporary realities, we need to pause before we declare every single one of them as terrorists. If that state does it, we need to also take that with a grain of salt. Because every state has done it. When we fought the British did it. When we fought the Mughals did it. When we fight the Indians, the Indian does it. And I'm going to add this to it. If we had to take on, enough Sikhs take on issues in Canada and US and UK or any country in the world, in Myanmar, some Sikh students took them on. And then they were declared, they're doing the wrong things. So the point being, the world loves our inspiration and our warriorness. Sikh warriorness doesn't come from the ideas of vengeance, doesn't come from the ideas of violence. It comes from the ideas of justice. And that justice is born out of our love with the divine. And our divine is one, which we interpret as being oneness, which means we see that love in the whole creation, in all of 8 billion people. So Sikhs and Punjabis do not hate India. They have no vengeance towards India. This is very clear in our history. It's very clear even today. And if an individual or an organization who says that, Sikhs quickly denounce that. This happened even this week. So that cannot be the narrative. Everyone knows that's not the narrative. So why do we allow that narrative to continue? Every Sikh, Punjabi, and anyone who's trying to understand Sikhs, anyone who's trying to play a role in solving some of the issues of last 2 weeks, they must understand this. So now what do we do then? Look, our inspiration is going to come from Gurbani. So I have 2 things. First, Sikhs like to quote, and I'm seeing this making the rounds in Sikh circles even this week, in last 2 weeks. And the line they like to quote is that Jaikar kiyo dharmiya ka papi ko dand diyo. I mean, literally it says that the one, the part which doesn't get talked about is the one, not I or you, not a particular Sikh organization, not a particular state, because our awards and our punishments are right now coming from them. Sikhs who become instruments of the one, they need to understand that the principled ones are awarded by the one. And the papi, classically the sinners, interpretively the criminals, they are punished by the one as well. So the ones who talk about these things, whether we take awards from a state or whether we are punishing on behalf of the state, are you doing that on behalf of the one? Are you an instrument of the one, or are you an instrument of a state or vengeance? This is something we really need to understand. Okay. And justice plays many, the line, that line is a part of a larger body. And the line previously actually says very clearly, Har aap baha kare nyao, kudyar sab maar kadoe, that it is the one which delivers the justice and kills the kudyar, the trash ones, the false ones. So before we start using this as a dictum or against or for by the state, because state does the same thing. Indian state also does the same thing. They use Sikh paradigms when they are fighting people on their border. And Sikhs are fighting them many a time. They use Gurbani and our secondary text and our war cries in those scenarios. But everyone among the Sikh verse needs to really understand this is about justice. And justice for us is born out of love, born out of one's paradigm. And then the second part, which I think is the most important, because I'm looking at an instructional moment as well as an opportunity for us. Instruction for me, what is Gurbani saying? Like what kind of sin and pain are coming here, right? Because we are very pained. We get pained by this when particular right-wing think tank institute publishes a report in UK or in Canada or in India or in US. We are very pained. I know every Sikh gets pained because I get those calls from the ones who do not even subscribe to particular politics. Even they are pained when we get painted as terrorists, right? Because they do it with a one stroke.
Yeah.
This line is for all of us. Look, Guru Nanak Sahib, in the most oft repeated Bani of Japji, he talks about this very element 4 times. How do we eliminate this crimes and how do we eliminate this pain? And he says the only way we can do this is by sunaya. Sunaya dukh pap ka nas. Listening. We got to listen to the one. We cannot just listen to what Karan Thapar said, what Jaishankar said, or NSA of India or Canada said, what Just Economist wrote, what SFJ spokesperson said. All that is becoming part of the noise. What Akal Tak says, what SGPC says, what this podcast is saying. Those all data points. At the end of the day, for Sikhs and for Punjabis who identify with Sikhs, and for global citizens who like Sikh paradigm and want to identify with it, we only listen to the one. That idea of Ikwankar. So Sunaya, by listening to that, which means eventually you can then follow that. Dukh pap ka nas, we destroy the pains and we destroy the sinful elements. And but why do we do that? Because Nanak Bhagta Sada Vigas. And I want to really mention that here. In Guru Nanak's end goal, the devoted ones are always in bloom. Right now, we are not blooming. The world is not blooming. The American politics is showing this, Indian politics is showing this, Punjab's politics is showing this, Canadian politics is showing this. This is where Punjab, Sikh, India, Canada is coming together. And nobody is blooming. And Guru Nanak Sahib very clearly says, only the devoted ones are always blooming. The reason they are always blooming is because they are listening to the one's message to eliminate what? Eliminate the pains and eliminate the crimes. And when we say bloom, bloom is not just a floweriness, that it's a state or time of beauty, state or time of freshness, as well as vigor. So this is an opportunity to bring out the beauty and the freshness and the vigor such that I individually can bloom. And in that blooming, I get to work towards an instrument of the one to eliminate the pains and the crimes.
Yeah, I think that's a perfect way to end. I was going to ask about sort of necessary steps, but I think you've given them. I think cultivating that relationship and pursuing a blooming, even in the midst of all of this noise, is, I think that's great.
Well, that's the individual work, right? And that's what I ended with. Previously, I said supporting people in India, in Punjab, in Canada, in US, those who are actually following the facts, and the narrative is built on that, not built on some extreme right or some extreme state related or particular organization's violent or extrajudicial agenda. And Sikhs are very clear on that. I think most Sikhs are very, very clear on this. Even so, when a particular, and that's the work.
Yeah.
So individuals' work is to get inspired on their work by listening to the one. Okay? And then outgrowth of that in the community is that people who are writing, people who are speaking about this, people who are documenting this, people who are working with the Indian administration, the Canadian administration, the US, the UK, the human rights group, the Australians, the ones who are trying to change positions with allies, whether in each of these countries who are non-Sikhs, all of them, if they do it by listening to the idea of one, we will be in a much better position. We will make India better, not only just Punjab and Sikh situation.
Thank you so much. This was really helpful in kind of understanding not just the last few months, but this larger, I guess the larger year and a half, 2 years. So thank you so much.
Oh, well, thank you, Jasleen, for bringing the context and the ideas to it. And look, the narrative is pretty clear. Sikh narrative from day one is we fight unjust religious people and unjust political people. And generally, the unjust religious and the political is what comprises the state. Our journey continues. Since 1947, it is intense relationship with India. And I think the world is taking notice. And since 84, it has been an intense relationship even with Canada. And the world is taking notice. And now there is an opportunity for us to reduce some of those tensions and create some understanding and hopefully some justice and reconciliation.
That's great. Thank you so much.
You were listening to SikhCast by Sikh Research Institute, illuminating every path.